Welcome to today's PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. We are featuring a female scientist today in honor of International Women's Day. My name is Stacey Joyce. I'll be your host. And if you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by clicking chat near the top left corner of your screen. And make sure when you do that, you change the to field in that chat message so that it includes attendees. That's just important so those who are also joining us live from other classrooms can see what your students are asking. And you can send those questions anytime throughout the presentation or the Q&A section later on. I will make sure to just queue them up. If you do send them through the presentation, I'll just sort of put them in line and we'll make sure we get to them as soon as we are in the Q&A portion. Today's guest is Dr. Amy Greer. Amy is the Canada Research Chair in Population Disease Modeling. She is also at the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College at University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Greer. I will let you take it away.
Perfect. So thank you. I'm really excited for this to be my first Partners in Research webinar. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here with you so that everybody can see what I have going on. Perfect. So like Stacey said, my name's Amy Greer and I'm a professor at the Ontario Veterinary College, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of research that my group does, which is related to infectious disease spread, and we're interested in how disease is spread within populations. And I should also say that I'm going to give you some examples of work that we've done that focuses on horses. And so I have some pictures here of our equine research team here at the Ontario Veterinary College. And these include folks who I work with, who are other professors, as well as other students. And so I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about a network. And so imagine that this is you. This is you with the sunglasses in the middle, and this is your friend. And my group uses something called network analysis to understand disease transmission. So if this is you and this is your friend, we draw a line between you because the two of you come in contact with each other. And in network analysis, we call the people or the animals nodes, and the line that connects you is called an edge. So you also have other friends. And those friends have contact with you, and they also have contact with other people who you know. And so this really forms your direct contact network. The people who you come in contact with at school, maybe at your hockey practice, maybe people who you see in your family. And those people also have people they come in contact with. And those are people who you may not even know, and yet they're part of your contact network because you're all connected through different people who you know within your different settings. Now, what we're interested in understanding in my group is the way that diseases transmit across a network. And so you can see down here, I've added in this little emoji who has his mask on. And so we're interested in the ways in which a disease might spread. So if we have a group of people who are connected, and if a disease or a sickness is spread by, let's say, coughing or sneezing on other people, the people who you're most likely to transmit that disease to are the other people you have contact with. So in this case, this individual may go on to transmit their sickness to some other people who they're connected to. And as you can see, the sickness spreads across the entire network. And we're interested in understanding what causes the disease to spread in this way, and also what can we do if we understand the way in which individuals are connected. How can we prevent everyone in the network from getting sick? And so if we go back to our original network, the other thing is that you'll see that some people in the network have lots of contacts. This person here has contact with 3 people across the top and then 2 on the bottom, so is connected to 5 other people. And some people in the network have very few contacts, so they only may contact 1 other person. And we would think that this probably influences how good of a spreader you are of a disease across the network. If you have lots of connections, you're probably more likely to be a spreader if you get sick. In network analysis, we sometimes resize the nodes or the circles, And we can resize them based on how many connections you have. And so someone who has a lot of connections, we might make their node really big, and somebody who has few connections, we might make their node very small. This allows us to think about where we might act in the network. So for instance, if we think somebody who has lots of connections might be a risk to other people, we might want to try to do something that allows that to stop in terms of the spread. So they might be a good person to perhaps try to isolate or put into quarantine so that they don't spread the sickness across the network. So one strategy that we can use is vaccination. So for instance, if we had this emoji network and we vaccinated this person in the middle, what that essentially does is disconnect the network. It removes that person because they now can't become sick. And as a result, all of these other people who were connected to them are no longer able to get sick. If we think about this in terms of your big network, coming back to you in the middle here with the sunglasses, if we were to vaccinate this node that sits right in the middle of the network and remove it, what that does is it breaks the whole network into 3 smaller groups. And so you might be able to imagine that this would be a useful strategy to prevent and control diseases, because now if we have a person who enters into the network who's ill, they might transmit their sickness, but they only transmit to a much smaller group. This group number 1 is not connected into the rest of the network, which is protective. So it means that not as many people become ill. The other thing we could do is something like isolation. And in this case, if we knew who was connected to whom, we could use that information to make decisions about trying to cut those individuals off from the network to prevent spread. So if you look here, we have the individual who has the little mask on. If we knew who that person's connections are, we can remove the edges or the connections that connect them into the rest of the network. And this acts in the same way. And so if these people become sick, because we've isolated them from the network, it means they can't spread. And so everybody else in the network remains healthy. So the challenge with this when we want to think about animal networks is that this makes sense for human networks, but even then it's kind of hard, because how would we know who you have contact with? And sometimes researchers do studies where they might give you a sheet of paper and ask you to write down who you came in contact with. And that might be easy if I asked you who you came in contact with from the time you got up this morning until lunchtime today. So you might say, well, I had contact with my family when I woke up, and I had contact with my classmates when I arrived at school. It might be more difficult if I asked you to remember over a longer time period. The other question is, how do you know what constitutes a contact? Do you have to have contact where you touched the person, or is sitting next to the person enough? Or, does it count contact with the crossing guard who helped you to get to school today? So it gets really tricky to try and remember who you had contact with and what really counts as a contact. And for instance, if I were to ask this elephant who he had contact with, he might draw me a picture and say, well, here's who I had contact with. And the problem is, what if this elephant lives with 5 other elephants? How would I know which one it was referring to? And so we have to have some way to collect the data in a better way. And I'm going to give you an example using horses, which is an area in which my group works. And what you might not know about horses is that they have lots of different types of jobs. So horses can be found racing. They might be horses that people use for competitions. Different types of jobs that horses have mean that they move around a lot. People move their horses to go and attend a race at a racetrack or go to attend a horse show someplace. But the other thing about horses is that they also can get respiratory illnesses. And what that means is, much like with people, they can get illnesses which cause them to get a runny nose and a bad cough and sometimes a fever. And those sicknesses can be spread between horses. And so we're interested in trying to understand what sorts of opportunities might exist for disease transmission within groups of horses, but how would we actually do that? So you can imagine if we have a bunch of farms, this is kind of now taking our emoji network and thinking about an animal network of horses. If we have a bunch of different farms with horses on them, these horses might come from all different places and congregate at one location. You know, that might be a racetrack, it might be a fairgrounds where you have a horse show. But if one of those horses was sick with some sort of illness, like a bacteria or a virus, they might be able to transmit it to another horse when they're congregated at that activity, and then they return to their home farm where they could go on to infect other horses. And so this is something we obviously want to prevent. We want to prevent disease from spreading within this sort of setting. So in some ways, what we could do is, if we go back to this example, if the horses were vaccinated, then we don't actually have transmission that occurs. If all of these other horses were vaccinated, that might prevent them from becoming sick, even though they had exposure to that sick horse. And that means that the other horses at the home facility also are protected. Another possibility, which is something that veterinarians tend to recommend to horse owners, is something called isolation. So if you travel away from home with your horse, one way to make sure that your horse hasn't picked up any sort of germs or bacteria or viruses while they've been away from home is to isolate the horse when you come back. So keeping it separate from the other horses you might have for some period of time to make sure that if your horse does become sick, it doesn't infect the rest of your horses. So this is an example of a much bigger network. So we talked about our little emoji network and we talked about our little horse network. This is a network that actually Dr. Kelsey Spence, who was a PhD student with me, collected at a big horse show in Ontario. And the colored dots actually represent horses who attended this horse show. And there were about 60 horses, and they came from all over the province of Ontario, and they came to a fairground where they participated in a competition. Now, 60 horses doesn't really sound like that many horses, really, I guess. But the really interesting thing when we asked owners about the horses who were attending is that they had come from all over Ontario, and they were connected. When we asked about how many horses were at their home facility, we represent those in this graph, this network figure, as black dots. And so that actually meant those 60 horses were connected to almost 800 other horses. So if you think about opportunities for disease spread, that's a lot of horses. Horses who didn't even attend the show could be at risk of contracting some sort of illness if an illness were to be introduced into this sort of network. And also it could spread quite rapidly because those horses had come from all across Ontario. So this is an even more complicated network. So this is a network, and again, the circles, which kind of get covered up by all of the lines that go everywhere. It's like a big squiggly, ball of string. But this shows horses moving between different horse racetracks in the province of Ontario. And so horses move to be able to participate in races, and they move between lots of different racetracks. And so you can imagine when we have all of these movements of animals from place to place, this represents opportunities for diseases to spread across the edges of the network, or represented by the line. And here, where we have thicker lines, the thicker lines represent more horses moving between those different locations on different dates. So one thing we might want to do is try to understand how animals come in contact with each other. And we can collect data by asking people to fill in surveys, but people forget things. So it's a lot easier to be able to find some other way to do this. And so what we do is we use a little device, and this is a very small thing called an active RFID tag. And so these small little devices allow us to collect the data digitally, and so we don't actually have to have the horse tell us who it comes in contact with, or the animal in general. In this case, Simon here is wearing one of these tags, and it's wrapped up under the purple vet wrap that is on his nose piece. And what that does is we put those on all of the horses at the facility, and those tags record who comes in contact with whom. So when two horses are close to each other, they exchange information, and the tags record that information for us to then take back to the lab and download, and then we can generate network figures which tell us who came in contact with whom. And so you can see here, this is a picture from a farm that we studied near Guelph, and you can see on the paddock gate, we have all the harnesses, all the halters lined up with the tags on them, and we also have tags in different locations, like on the farm gate. And what this allows us to do is generate a network. And so here, these are networks from a farm that had 9 horses. And so we learned a new word, right? Node. Node is the dot in the network, and the edge is the line between the dots. And here we have 9 horses, and what you'll see is that the networks change over time. So this horse on day 1 had a lot of contact, was connected to almost all of the other horses on day 1. On day 5, this same horse only came in contact with one other horse at the farm. And so having an understanding of how animals contact each other allows us to make better informed decisions about how to prevent the spread of diseases within these sorts of networks. This is another way that we can represent this. And so if each of those horses had a number from 1 to 9, we can make a little graph like this, which shows different colors. And so each color tells us how much contact different pairs of horses have. So if they have no contact, the square would be white. And if they have lots of contact, it would be very dark, so red. So in this case, if horse number 9 were to become sick, we would be able to know that horse number 7 and horse number 6 are the horses that have the most contact with that sick horse, and we should maybe try to isolate them to disconnect them from the network in case they too were going to become sick. So the take-home message here is really that my group studies contact patterns, and contact patterns are really important for us to understand the risk of disease introduction and spread. Animal contact patterns are really hard to measure, and we have some new technology that we've been using to make this possible, to allow us to digitally record contact patterns without having to do a lot of paper-based research. And understanding contact patterns can allow us to better identify disease prevention and control strategies. So what should we do to be able to protect populations from having diseases spreading within them? So on that note, I will turn it back over to Stacy, and we can go from there.
Well, thank you so much. I had no idea we would see so many emojis today and learn so much from emojis today. That was awesome. We have particularly our class at Allenby Public School that's been furiously asking questions already. So we've got a few to begin with. So the grade 5s at Allenby are wondering, what is in a vaccination that cures the illness?
So the vaccine actually doesn't cure the illness. That's a good question. So the vaccine, what that does is it allows your body, your immune system, to be able to recognize that virus or that bacteria if your body were to encounter it. So a vaccine is really a prevention measure. It's something that we do in advance of actually coming in contact with the bacteria or virus, so that when our body does come in contact with that bacteria or that virus, it's able to mount an immune response and protect us from becoming infected.
Right. And sort of related to that idea of being in contact with a bacteria or a virus and becoming infected, they're wondering why kids and older adults get sick faster.
Oh, that's a good question. So, I mean, I don't know that kids or adults get sick faster necessarily. Some types of diseases or some types of sicknesses are more common in different age groups. And so we know that some age groups tend to have certain things more often than others. So, you know, before chickenpox vaccine was something that kids received, which now most kids do receive a chickenpox vaccine. Before that was the case, chickenpox was kind of something that mostly kids got when they were young. So, I mean, it's really a function of the pathogen itself. Some tend to infect younger people, some tend to infect older people. It kind of just depends on the pathogen of interest.
Interesting. And can animals and humans give each other diseases?
Oh, that is a really good question, and that's a really super important question. So yes, they can. And that's one of the most important areas of research in infectious diseases, I would say personally right now. is that a lot of emerging diseases, so those are diseases that are new in people, come from animals. And the estimate actually is that, over 80% of emerging diseases have come from animal populations. And so it's a really big question. And there are lots of types of animals which tend to be associated with those sorts of emerging diseases. So bats, for instance, tend to have lots of viruses that they carry around that can, potentially infect people. So an example of that is something called Nipah virus, which is found in bats and can infect pigs, and then bats and pigs can infect people as a result. One of the students in my group is studying something called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, and that's a really long name, and we shorten it and call it MERS-CoV. But that's a disease that's kind of like SARS, so it causes coughing and respiratory symptoms, but it infects people, and it tends to come from camels. So people who live in the Middle East area where they have contact with camels can contract this MERS disease. And so yes, most certainly diseases can come from animals and infect people, and people can also infect animals. There are examples of people, for instance, transmitting their influenza virus to pigs as a good example.
Interesting. So definitely a two-way street then.
Two-way street. And we call those zoonotic diseases. So diseases that can go between people and animals or vice versa are called zoonotic diseases.
I don't know why it's going to seem silly, but that term zoonotic just sounds way more fun than it actually is, obviously. Next question comes from the grade 6s at St. Patrick in Ottawa, wondering what is the most dangerous disease that can be passed from an animal to a human?
Well, that is a really tricky question, actually, because I guess the question would be what your definition of dangerous is. Because as someone who studies infectious diseases, there are different kind of measures of how bad something is. So, one measure of how bad something is might be, does the disease infect people and cause them, to die as a result of their infection? That would probably be considered a pretty bad disease. Or is it a bad disease just if it gets transmitted really quickly between people? Maybe it doesn't cause you to get super sick, but maybe lots and lots of people are going to have it. So it's hard to say because it depends on the characteristics of the disease itself. So some diseases are a concern because they're highly transmissible. They're very easy to spread within populations. Other diseases might be hard to spread, but if you do get it, your risk of having, very serious sickness and or even dying from your disease might be the case. And so it's hard to really say. I think there are kind of those two different scenarios, and it kind of depends on your definition of dangerous.
So what would be a very serious illness that could pass from an animal to a human? So if you think of the worst symptoms, what would be the one that fits that category?
The worst symptoms. Well, I mean, certainly, people are may be familiar with the Ebola virus. And so Ebola virus is an emerging disease. It's a virus that was an emerging disease, is still an emerging disease, and emerged from animals, really. And so, that causes very, very severe symptoms, clinical symptoms, is highly transmissible, and the mortality rate is incredibly high. So, I mean, that's an example of something that's an emerging infectious disease that has very, very serious consequences.
Right. And back to our class at Allenby, they're wondering what is the most common illness that people get or spread?
What is the most common illness? I'm not really sure. I would guess it's probably, a group of viruses that we probably call, causing respiratory illness. So, colds and influenza and those types of pathogens tend to be things that, if you think even as yourself, as a student, how many colds do you think you've had over the course of the school year already? Ask your teacher how many colds they've had over the school year since September started, or your parents. Ask them how many, colds, sniffly noses, coughs. So, I think the average, actually, I think there was a research paper that was published that said the average person has 3 or 4 kind of respiratory illnesses every year. So, that probably is the most common constellation of symptoms, if you will.
But each one is a little bit different, correct? So we're lumping them together. They feel sort of similar to us, but those 3 or 4 colds that you get in a year, are they typically all different viruses causing that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are lots and lots of pathogens which cause people to have similar symptoms. And so that's, it's hard to know whether or not if you have 3 colds in a year, it's hard to know whether those 3 colds were all caused by rhinovirus, which is a virus that, we typically call the cold virus, or, was it something called, was it influenza, or was it some other virus? And that's hard to know because most of those cold-like sicknesses, we're not really sick enough to go to the doctor as a result. And so without having your doctor take a sample and send it to the lab and have the lab actually look to say what is the virus or the bacteria that you have, it's really hard to say. But there are many, many different types of pathogens which cause very similar symptoms. Yes, so it is possible that if you have multiple colds in a year, they may or may not be caused by different pathogens.
Okay. Now we have a question from the grade 7s at Dr. Marion Hilliard Senior Public School. They're wondering if there are any animals that seem resistant to diseases.
I don't know that there are any animals that are totally resistant to diseases, but what I will say is that certainly from an agriculture perspective, and here at the University of Guelph, we have a strong emphasis on livestock and kind of agricultural animals. One of the things that people do is try to breed animals so that they perhaps have enhanced immunity. So maybe, they're not totally resistant, but it is possible to have kind of genetic components of animals or populations which are more resistant to certain types of pathogens. And so, that's something that agricultural people are very interested in doing because, obviously that would be a really good thing. If the animals don't get sick as much, that would be very good for farmers. And good for the animals too, because you don't want your animals to be sick.
Right. And in your research, have you come across any species of animal that just seems to get more or less sick than the average? Like, say, do horses tend to get sick more often than pigs, or vice versa, or something else completely?
No, I don't know that there's any way to say one way or the other, but what I will say is that, within the Canadian context at least, when we think about horses, and the example I gave, horses move around a lot, and there aren't a lot of things, we have recommendations for what we call biosecurity or infection control. So one example would be when you take your horse somewhere else, we recommend that you take your own bucket, for instance. So don't let your horse share water and food buckets with other horses that are there. Bring your own, because that way your horse doesn't have contact with germs that might have been brought in on other horses. The difference with other agricultural species especially is that things like pigs or chickens or even dairy cows, farms have very strict biosecurity. So for instance, pig farms have very, very detailed biosecurity protocols. And in fact, one of my students went to a pig farm and was there to be part of a research project and help someone out with collecting some data. And she was very surprised to learn that when you arrive at a pig barn, you actually have to have a shower because they're concerned that you as a person might give the pigs some sort of illness. And so, you know, it's very a big concern about the introduction of pathogens. And so when she arrived, she was surprised to find that she had to have a shower, a full shower, put on, you know, special barn overalls so that she didn't bring her own clothes or her own boots or things into the barn, and that's to protect the animals from diseases that you might bring in with you. And then when you leave the barn, you also have to have a shower, and then your clothes all go in the laundry and you leave with your clean clothes that haven't come in contact with the animals. So I would say that the biosecurity practices for different animal species are very different.
I think that's very contrary to what people think of when they think of pigs. If they haven't been in contact with a pig farm or had any education on that, we tend to think that we would be far cleaner, and that would be silly. But it makes a lot of sense that you know, they're taking every precaution to make sure that the animals stay as healthy as possible.
Exactly.
So we're toward the end of our time here. I just want to squeeze in a couple more questions. The first one is going to take us to the edge, I think, of our topic today. But the grade 8s at Louis Riel in Calgary are wondering if you think we're at a greater risk of contracting diseases as the climate warms and the polar ice caps melt.
Oh, that is a really good question. Wow. Calgary is really pushing my limits today. I mean, so this is an area actually that I have students in my lab who, my students work in this area. And one of the questions has been that, you know, there are environmental components to infectious disease transmission. And we know that for some diseases, for instance, rainier weather increases the risk of contracting diseases that are waterborne, for instance, or changes in temperature can influence the risk of people or animals contracting diseases. And so I think it's a real concern, to be honest. You know, the climate change scenarios suggest that we will expect quite significant changes over the coming years in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, so having more of our snow fall as rain instead as things warm up. And that changes a lot of things. The other thing about climate change is that it also introduces the possibility of tick and mosquito-borne diseases. So diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes, so West Nile virus or, you know, Zika virus, things that are transmitted by mosquitoes who bite you, or things like Lyme disease, which are transmitted by ticks. Those insects, their populations will change a lot as the temperature and the climate changes. And so the risk that those types of insects move into new areas is a really big risk for disease transmission, for sure.
Well, I guess we'll certainly be seeing those changes, and I bet there will be researchers right there to, as you said, sort of track those changes and see what's happening and make projections to the future. I do want to ask another question from the grade 6s in Ottawa, wondering what happens if there is a virus or a disease outbreak or an epidemic? And maybe I can bring that to a little bit more of a narrow focus and ask what people can do maybe to limit their exposure or to stay as healthy as possible in the middle of an epidemic.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the number, you know, as somebody who studies infectious diseases, I think the number one thing that we can do all the time, which is super easy to do, and if you were my kids think I'm a broken record because this is like an ongoing thing at our house, is to wash your hands and really wash them well. I know it takes so much time out of your day, but hand washing is a huge, huge thing. And so that's really kind of the easiest public health intervention is hand washing. And it makes a huge difference. And so if I could tell you one thing, it would be wash your hands after you use the bathroom and before you eat. So I mean, that's an important public health intervention. Other public health interventions are also really important. I mean, things like staying up to date on your vaccination schedule, following, the public health recommendations around, different sorts of activities, making sure that you're preparing your food in a way that's going to keep you healthy. So, not mixing your raw chickeny bacteria with your vegetables and using the same knife. I mean, those are really simple things. And I think sometimes people overlook the fact that those are really important disease control interventions, which prevent us from getting sick and minimize our exposure to pathogens on a day-to-day basis.
I'll have to record that little section of our webinar to play for my children so they can hear someone else's broken record about washing hands. The very last question I wanted to finish with today is for any students who might be really interested in pursuing this field, or students who, we've talked about how this is sort of math meets biology and smushed together to do the research that you do. Do you have any advice for them, or in terms of where to go from here if they think this might be a field for them?
Yeah, so I think, in today we've kind of talked a lot about, networks and diseases, but what might have kind of gotten glossed over is that all of those networks we analyze using mathematics. There are ways for us to compute different things about the networks which allow us to better understand the risk of disease transmission. And so, biology, if you're interested in infectious diseases, biology and math really go hand in hand. And I think that sometimes, when I was a student, I overlooked that. I really loved biology. And I kind of thought, well, math is very unrelated to biology, so I'll just focus on, my biology studies. But I think more and more mathematics is playing a huge role in our understanding of infectious disease dynamics, so making sure that you have a strong understanding of both. And also the other thing is computer science. We talked about these little tags that we're using to collect the data. We had to work with computer scientists to be able to do this, and so that means writing code, flashing firmware to these little tags. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that when I was a student interested in biology, I didn't realize that there were, potentially so many different avenues, that a lot of the work we do as scientists is very interdisciplinary, and it takes, a real team of people who have lots of different expertise to come together and really work on some of these big challenges that we have. So, biology, math, computer science, I think they all go together, and they're going to be areas where there's, related to infectious diseases, I think there's going to be lots and lots of continued work in this area. It's not going anywhere anytime soon.
And I think that's a really great message, that you can be interested in any one of those areas and still decide to focus your efforts on a problem like in infectious diseases, or something else maybe in particular as well. But just the idea that we think of that as a biology thing, and as you said, there's certainly a lot more going on now, and who knows in 10 years what else will be involved. So I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Greer, for taking the time to teach us a bit about these contact networks today, and what our students can do to keep their hands clean, but also to pursue this if they're interested. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
On March 22nd, we are doing a special PIR live event for World Water Day. We'll be discussing microplastic pollution, and in particular in Canada. So more information about that webinar and other educational programs from Partners in Research is available at pirweb.org. Thanks so much for tuning in today, everyone. I hope you have a great day. Bye now.